Chapter 25 of the Technique of the Mystery Story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Henry Elliott, Stillwater, Oklahoma. The Technique of the Mystery Story by Carolyn Wells. Chapter 25. Further Advices. 1. The Use of Coincidences. An error into which the beginning author easily falls is the too lavish use of coincidences. While perhaps the majority of detective stories are founded upon coincidences, they must be made so plausible, so seemingly inevitable, that they shall not appear to be mere coincidences. A modern fiction detective thus frankly admits the value of coincidences in his work. "Don't forget the fortunate coincidences," replied Average Jones modestly. "They're about half of it. In fact, detective work, for all that is said on the other side, is mostly the ability to recognize and connect coincidences." But the reader cannot agree that a frankly announced coincidence makes as good a mystery problem as one where that element is left out. For instance, in The Adventure of Black Peter, in his confession, the criminal relates, "Like a fool I left my baccy pouch upon the table." The pouch so obligingly, even necessarily, left on the table was of course the clue to the criminal. As a further coincidence, this remarkable pouch bore the initials P.C., which quite conveniently pointed to a suspect named Peter Carey, as well as to the real criminal, Patrick Cairns. This being discovered, Sherlock Holmes says naively, "I was convinced that the initials P.C. upon the pouch were a coincidence, and not those of Peter Carey, since he seldom smoked and no pipe was found in his cabin." All of this shows too clearly the author's dependence on a coincidence. In the completed structure, the literary architect should not let his framework show, for it dispels illusion and either prevents or mars surprise. But the whole question of coincidence is too deep and too really scientific to attempt its discussion here. Poe knew it to its last and finest degree, but not everyone could follow its ramifications with the accuracy of his peculiar mind. He says in one instance, "Coincidences 10 times as remarkable as this, the delivery of the money and the murder committed within 3 days upon the party receiving it, happen to all of us every hour of our lives, without attracting even momentary notice. Coincidences, in general, are great stumbling blocks in the way of that class of thinkers who have been educated to know nothing of the theory of probabilities, that theory to which the most glorious objects of human research are indebted for the most glorious of illustrations. Though the theory of probabilities is too abstruse for any but scholars, a general knowledge of the relative values of coincidences is most useful to the writer of detective fiction." Poe says further, "There are few persons, even among the calmest thinkers, who have not occasionally been startled into a vague yet thrilling half-credence in the supernatural by coincidences of so seemingly marvelous a character that, as mere coincidences, the intellect has been unable to receive them. Such sentiments, for the half-credences of which I speak have never the full force of thought, are seldom thoroughly stifled unless by reference to the doctrine of chance, or, as it is technically termed, the calculus of probabilities. Now this calculus is, in its essence, purely mathematical, and thus we have the anomaly of the most rigidly exact in science applied to the shadow and spirituality of the most intangible in speculation. The avenues of thought opened to our minds by these suggestions are fascinatingly attractive, and could we study the matter seriously it would soon put an end to the many widespread fallacies of coincidence, such as receiving a letter from a friend one has been thinking of and ascribing it to telepathy, and like matters. Gaboriau appreciated the futility of depending upon the coincidence. "Don't forget," replied Lecoq, "that the field of conjecture is boundless. Imagine whatever complications you like. I am ready to maintain that such a complication has occurred or will present itself some day." Leuben, a German lunatic, bet that he would succeed in turning up a pack of cards in a certain order stated in a written agreement. He turned and turned 10 hours per day for 20 years. He had repeated the operation 4,246,028 times when he succeeded. But leaving aside these deeper doctrines, let us use coincidence when necessary, carefully veiling it, however, with plausibility. Work up to coincidences until it seems to occur naturally. Invent causes to produce the effects that otherwise would have seemed pure coincidence. 2. The use of melodrama. Another fault to be avoided is the use of melodramatic speech or incident. The day is past when readers are thrilled by the sort of diction that charmed Pomona of Rudder Grange as she read aloud, "Ha, ha, Lord Marmont! Thundered, thou too shalt suffer!" And yet, in A Scandal in Bohemia, we read, "And the papers?" asked the king hoarsely. "All is lost." It is difficult to discover a loss of "the papers" without melodramatic exclamation, but moderate speech of your characters at the time of the appalling discovery is as much as possible. Avoid, too, the use of sentiment. Romance is not now referred to, but other sentiments which, though acceptable in the story of manners, tend to distract the reader of detective fiction. This field recognizes few emotions and no moral, and as a human document it depends for its success upon the primitive instincts of mankind and the material indications thereof. 3. Dullness. Avoid dull and prosy descriptions. If any type of story depends on action and excitement, it is the type we are discussing. Keep before you always the question of your reader's attitude towards your work. Arrest their attention, rouse their curiosity, awake their interest, and you have made your start. Continue to stimulate all these to the highest pitch, and your story is written. Let your final explanation more than satisfy their anticipation, and you have made a success. Build everything toward the final climax, using minor surprises as stepping stones by the way. Continually produce the unexpected. Persistently lead the reader to believe one thing, and then suddenly convince him that he ought to have known it was another. Use every art and craft that in you lies to mislead him, but in such a way that when he is turned back to the right path he will vow he misled himself. Remember the two great principles. You have your facts as straight and true as a mathematical proposition, and to have your fancies as fascinating and elusive as a fairy tale. In a word, the ideal writer of detective fiction should be the child of Euclid and Scheherazade. 4. Unique plots and their solubility. Disdaining of or tiring of the regulation plot, some writers have branched off into erratic forms. This may be done with a wonderfully fine effect if done perfectly, but only a genius, and an experienced one at that, should attempt it. Perhaps the most brilliant achievement of this sort is Zangwill's Big Bow Mystery. As this book is now out of print, it may be well to state briefly its plot. A widowed landlady, a Mrs. Drabdump, after repeated knockings on the bolted bedroom door of her lodger, Arthur Constant, fails to awaken him. Terrified by vague fears of tragedy, she rushes across the street to implore the help of a neighbor, Mr. Goodman. He returns with her, and together they break in the bolted door of Constant's bedroom. A horrible sight meets Mrs. Drabdump's eyes, as she discovers the young man dead in his bed with his throat cut from ear to ear. Both windows are fastened, the door, until burst in, was both locked and bolted, and there is no other opening in the room. Add to this the fact that no razor or weapon of any sort can be found, and the problem seems insoluble. What is probably the best jury scene in fiction concludes logically that since the room could not have been entered by any intruder, it could not be murder and must be suicide. It also concludes logically that since no weapon is found, and the doctors declare that the wound could not have been self-inflicted, it could not be suicide and must be murder. This ingenious deadlock forms the nucleus of the story, which is elaborated with cunning skill and marvelous subtlety. The most experienced reader is not prepared for the surprising denouement which shows that the murder was committed by Mr. Grodman after he broke open the door and had been deliberately planned by him beforehand. Stated thus barely, the plot seems incredible, but as written by Mr. Zangwill, it is plausible, convincing, and intensely interesting. After all, detective stories depend upon the ingenuity of the author. In the best, intellect is paramount. Characters judged by other standards may seem unreal without disturbing the reader's equanimity, provided the chain of causation is kept logically perfect. Characters judged by other standards may seem unreal without disturbing the reader's equanimity, provided the chain of causation is kept logically perfect. The disregard of this axiom has resulted in many failures. Gaboriau, not content to write a mere tale of mystery, tries to convert it to a well-rounded novel. But the most notable recent instance of the thing was the endeavor by Gaston Leroux in The Perfume of the Lady in Black, the sequel to The Mystery of the Yellow Room. Without knowing quite why, readers found their interest in it flagging. In some respects it is the subtlest story of its kind. The shifting semi-tropical atmosphere is finely caught, not a priori to add intensity to the central mystery of doubtful identity. The mystery itself is developed with rare psychological insight, and the relation between a mother and son is so acutely defined as to make a certain noticeable halt in the process of detection seem perfectly natural. Yet impatience with the story is inevitable. From habit the reader holds his attention in readiness for running down a crime, for that and nothing more, and his mind relaxes when outlying material is brought in. Dr. Harry Thurston Peck says, "The indispensable condition of a good mystery is that it should be able and unable to be solved by the reader, and that the writer's solution should satisfy. Many a mystery runs on breathlessly enough until the denouement is reached, only to have the reader with the sense of having been robbed of his breath under false pretenses. And not only must the solution be adequate, but all its data must be given in the body of the story. The author must not suddenly spring a new person or a new circumstance upon the reader at the end. Thus, if a friend were to ask me to guess who dined with him yesterday, it would be fatuous if he had in mind somebody of whom he knew I had never heard. Irrespective of all else, it is the mystery that arouses curiosity to the pitch of demanding explanation that counts. By few has it been played with a skill like that of Wilkie Collins, who, with little characterization or sentiment, without creating individuals of fiction whom we remember, or whose sayings we quote, could hold the attention of the novel-reading world with his Woman in White, or set them eagerly agog to find the whereabouts of the mysterious diamond taken from its eastern sanctuary. For ingenuity of construction, blind leads, bafflings, and sustained interest, the Moonshine stands high in the catalogue of the mysteries of fiction, and the reader was penetrating to a degree who fastened upon Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite, the theft. 5. Women as writers of detective stories. Not a few among the best writers of detective fiction are women. That perspicacious critic, Julian Hawthorne, observes, "I have often marveled that women so seldom attempt the form of literature. Many of them possess a good constructive faculty, and their love of detail and of mystery is notorious. Perhaps they are too fond of sentiment, and sentiment must be handled with caution in riddle stories." And a contemporary English essayist thus compliments our foremost American detective story writer: "It may seem curious that women should be successful in a branch of fiction which many would be disposed to pronounce a masculine specialty. Perhaps Mrs. Green has herself supplied the explanation. In one of her best stories, That Affair Next Door, she introduces a very commonplace old maid, like most old maids, curious, secretive, keenly observant of her neighbors' affairs, and fond of speculating about other people's business. Circumstances throw her into the very center of a mysterious crime, and suddenly reveal in her all the qualities of a great detective. All the characteristics which make her a nuisance to her neighbors make her an invaluable ally to the police. The conception is a daring and, I think, a true one. I fancy that the two faculties which the great Sherlock declared to be the prime necessities of the detective, observation and deduction, are feminine rather than masculine faculties. It will hardly be disputed that it is so in regard to the former, while as to the latter, what man ever discovered so much about the inhabitants of the house opposite as any woman will deduce from the shape of their window blinds? Most women quite habitually indulge in the sort of ratiocination that Holmes practised over the old hat. Be that as it may, Mrs. A.K. Green herself has certainly as much right as any contemporary writer to claim the mantle of Gabreau for stories the excellent technique of which she has put some popular writers on this side of the Atlantic to shame. Anna Catherine Green, who is Mrs. Charles Rolfs in real life, is far and away the best in our home field. She is entirely conversant with all the rules of detective fiction, and her long list of books stands alone at the top shelf. She herself tells an amusing story in connection with her first book, the celebrated Leavenworth case. She wrote this story when quite young, and becoming absorbed in the work, wrote wherever she happened to be, using any kind of stationery that might be at hand, from the finest letter paper to the backs of old envelopes or torn-out ledger leaves. Unheeding the growing length of her story, she kept on until she had every drawer in an old bureau overflowing with its manuscript. Concluding at last, she stuffed all her papers into a large suitcase and sallied forth to a publisher. The first publisher she called upon eagerly accepted the story, but to her regret, the young author was obliged to cut out more than 40,000 words of her manuscript. The result was the most popular and the best-written detective novel by an American. Other feminine authors have succeeded in this field. Mary E. Wilkins' short story, The Long Arm, conforms to all the conditions required by the unwritten law. Natalie Lincoln, in The Trevor Case, and Mary Reinhardt Roberts, in The Circular Staircase, have done admirable work, as has also Stella M. During in Love's Pilgrimage. That Mainwaring Affair by A.M. Barber is among the masterpieces of construction, and Florence Warden may be accounted among the best authors of mystery stories in England. The series of short stories by Baroness d'Aukersey and Augusta Groner are as clever as any written by men. But whatever sex the writer, or of whatever manner or style the writing, the one end and aim of the author must be curiosity aroused, increased, and gratified. Other stories, other manners, but the detective story depends solely on this principle. And ever remember Mr. Zangwill's dictum: the mystery story is just one species of story that cannot be told impromptu or altered at the last moment, seeing that it demands the most careful piecing together and the most elaborate dovetailing. End of Chapter 25. Further Advices. Recording by Henry Elliott, Stillwater, Oklahoma.
Chapter 26 of The Technique of the Mystery Story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Technique of the Mystery Story by Carolyn Wells. Chapter 26. Final Advices. Until lately, the detective story has not been looked upon as worthy of serious consideration from a technical point of view. But in the minds of many, it has now risen to a place where it calls for standardization. Detective stories in the last half-century have progressed in two directions, good and bad. In fact, they've fairly mushroomed out in all grades of quality. And so, to meet the growing appreciation of a good detective story, it is worthwhile to do one's best in writing them as they should be written. True, hundreds of them are published every year, whose authors belong to the mob of gentlemen who wrote with ease. But although Pope made that very expressive line, he said also, "True ease in writing comes from art, not chance, as those move easiest who have learned to dance." In a recent book on the subject of the game of bridge, the author cleverly designates the grades of bridge players thus: idiots, butchers, tinkers, artists, and necromancers. The student of detective stories will at once recognize that these designations very aptly describe writers of detective fiction. As Poe was the master of this sort of technique, he was of course a necromancer. But the other names to be put in his class are exceedingly few. We have many artists writing detective stories, and many more who may be called tinkers. The lower grades, though voluminous in their output, we will not consider here. 1. General qualities of the detective story. But as a keynote to the story we would write, let us remember that its success depends first of all upon the interest of the mystery. Perhaps the voice of the public, as expressed by the literary critic, best tells us what is desired. To quote from the review of a very recent detective story, "The new physician sets about a stealthy investigation. He finds that in the neighboring house, behind the blue wall, something odd is in progress. The doors are locked against him. The eager question, which keeps the reader hurrying through the 400 pages, is, what will he discover? As often happens, the solution scarcely supports the weight of the mystery. The story is a fantastic tangle, written with polished literary craftsmanship, but it is too ingenious in its opening to live up to its promises. It leaves one disappointed. It is a blot on our escutcheon that we should be accused of often presenting an explanation too slight to support the mystery. Even polished literary craftsmanship cannot make up for the unpardonable sin of a disappointing solution. But this by no means disparages the value of literary excellence. This ought ye to have done, but not to leave the other undone. With all the power that in you lies, make for literary craftsmanship, but strive equally hard to perfect a plot which, though built on accepted even if hackneyed models, has a few points of absolute originality. Notice, in Anna Catherine Green's books, how there is invariably some clever original touch which has never been used before. In, for instance, Initials Only, the young woman is shot, fatally, but no bullet can be found. As we discover later, instead of a bullet, the assassin used an icicle. Could anything be more unexpected? The sharp needle of ice pierced her heart and of course melted immediately and left no trace. But the novel and original touches, though greatly desirable, are incidental to the plot, which should be built on the strong and rational foundations used by our best writers. As examples of excellent construction, read Hand and Ring, The Mystery of a Hansom Cab, The De Bercy Affair, That Mainwaring Affair, or The Accomplice. All of these are plotted entirely in accordance with the best usage, and may serve as models of construction. In the case of short stories, such definite and careful building of the plot is less imperative, as the author has room only for the single incident of the crime, and a short and swift account of its solution. Specially ingenious plots like Big Bow Mystery, or The Mystery of the Yellow Room, may not be achieved by everyone, but all may pay heed to the soundness of construction required by even the simplest plot. 2. Correctness. As in everything else, the writer should be careful of his diction. In a way, the detective story demands accurate English even more than polished expression. We have seen the word suspicion used as a verb in a story by an educated author. Even Sir Conan Doyle allows his wonderful work to be marred by such slips as inferred for implied, relation for relative, and even an absolute grammatical error when Holmes says, "It would be robbing you of the credit of the case if I was to presume to help you." Again, one frequently meets with such errors as a reference to Frankenstein, when what they really mean is Frankenstein's monster. All of these things are unpardonable, and especially so in a field of literature where accuracy is a prime element. Without overworking the poor words, learn to use intelligently and correctly. Deduce, connote, vital, and incidental, fact and truth, and all of the catchwords that belong to the peculiar conditions of our subject. Even ratiocination. 3. Names. Especial attention should be paid to the names of the characters in our story. If the influence of a right name is felt in real life, how much more so in fiction? In real life, it is a matter of chance or of lucky accident if the baptismal name prove a just and congruous one, suited to the character and the circumstances of the owner. The natural parent may claim forgiveness for error on the score that he could not foresee the possible career of the child whom he may have handicapped at the altar. The author of a work of fiction can make no such plea. His characters should take form in his brain, like Minerva in the skull of Jupiter. They should be armed at all points, and the most vulnerable point of their equipment is an unworthy name. Yet, knowledge of the thing desired does not necessarily lead to its easy discovery. It is a matter for thought, for research, for studious inquiry. Great skill and nicety of perception must be called into play. The effect must not be too crudely palpable. Suggestion, not insistence, is needed. The good old trick which pleased our simpler forefathers, that which consists in merely labeling a character, an ingenuous but not ingenious stratagem, has had its day. It was carried to an extreme in the early English drama, where even Shakespeare gives us such names among his minor characters as mouldy, feeble, shadow, shallow, etc. And it retained its hold on the comic stage down to the time of the Lydia Languishes, the Sneerwells, and the Mrs. Malaprops of Sheridan, the Sir Fopling Flutters of Vanbrugh. While such definitely descriptive names are perhaps not to be used, let us at least choose names that will seem to connote the effect intended. Scientific Sprague is a good name because it is especially descriptive, and perhaps also because it is alliterative. We remember that name when we would not remember LeDroit Connors, who figures in an equally good series of stories. Craig Kennedy does not stick in our memory like the Thinking Machine, and Rouletabille, though expressive in intent, has not the arrestiveness of Raffles. 4. Titles. And if the names of the characters are in their way important, how much more so is the title of the story? When Poe began his stories, no titles were hackneyed, and he was at liberty to use The Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Mystery of Marie Roget without being trite. But, as both these titles have been borrowed hundreds of times, it is wise for the young writer to endeavor to think up an original title. Conan Doyle was an artist at this, and though all of his titles were The Adventure of, the rest of the phrase was so striking as to command interest at once. Whose curiosity would not be aroused by The Adventure of the Speckled Band, or The Adventure of the 5 Orange Pips? Incidentally, Conan Doyle has mentioned a dozen or more attractive titles, to which he has never yet written stories. We wish that we might read of The Adventure of the Paradol Chamber, The Singular Tragedy of the Atkinson Brothers at Trincomalee, and many others of this list of equally fascinating titles. The Darlington Substitution Scandal, The Arnsworth Castle Affair, The Affair of the Amateur Mendicant Society, The Loss of the Sophie Anderson, The Adventure of the Grice Pattersons in Ufa, The Camberwell Poisoning Case, The Dundas Separation Case, The Affair of the Reigning Family of Holland, The Adventure of the Tired Captain, The Trepoff Murder, The Affair of the Netherlands Sumatra Company, The Tankerville Club Scandal, The Case of Mrs. Etheridge, The Affair of the King of Scandinavia, The Manor House Case, The Tarleton Murder, The Affair of the Aluminum Crutch, The Case of Vamberry, the Wine Merchant, Ricoletti of the Club Foot and his Abominable Wife, The Adventure of the Old Russian Woman. But many authors content themselves with The Mystery of Maple Hollow, or The Connolly Case. Such titles as That Mainwaring Affair, That Affair at Elizabeth, That Affair Next Door, are good in their way, but the phrase has been overworked. Some titles are so obvious that they are repeated, probably unwittingly, by various authors. The Long Arm has been chosen as a title by Samuel N. Gardenhire, E. Phillips Oppenheim, Richard Harding Davis, and Mary E. Wilkins. A Mysterious Disappearance appealed to the taste of 3 or 4 authors, while The Corpus Delicti took the fancy of 2 or 3 more. Such titles as The Scales of Justice or Vengeance is Mine are entirely legitimate, though not novel. Titles like those chosen by Anna Catherine Green are much more to be commended. The Woman in the Alcove, The Doctor, His Wife, and the Clock, Initials Only, or One of My Sons, are unique and therefore arrestive. The Trevor Case is a hackneyed style of title, while The Circular Staircase is not. As a general rule, avoid unpleasant words in a title. Omit the words murder, crime, or blood. These words are inevitable in your text, but unattractive in your title. In fine, do your best to make both matter and manner of your story the best that in you lies, and never for a moment commit the error of thinking that because you are writing a detective story, you may scamp your efforts to achieve good literature. We quote by permission the following advice by Mr. Arlo Bates. Though written for the benefit of young authors in all fields of literature, it may be applied especially to writers of detective fiction. A youth who decides to follow a life of letters will not do amiss to be frank with himself at the start. He may say to his inner self, I can make money with my pen. It is a business like another. I should find it pleasant, to be sure, to try to produce literature, but I see that it does not pay. I prefer the flesh pots of Egypt, hot, well-filled, highly spiced, to any vague promises of the delights of a far-off and rather doubtful Canaan of art. I will write what people will buy, and I will take my reward as I go, in pleasant applause and good hard cash. Or, if he be of another mind, he may have the hardihood to say to himself something of this sort: It is true that if I do the best I can in literature, I shall be hard put to it to pay the butcher and the baker. The candlestick maker will dwell in abundance, while by the glimmer of a tallow dip set in the meanest of his wares I wearily, and very likely hungrily, write that which not one man in 1,000 would care to read, and not one woman in 10,000 would think of taking out of the circulating library. There is, moreover, the gravest doubt whether, even after I am dead, and cannot enjoy it if it comes, reputation will crown my work. Yet, in spite of all this, I am so constituted that the delight of doing my best, the pleasure of serving my art, will make up to me for all that I forego in choosing to strive toward literary perfection. I elect to walk while others ride, to be splashed by mud from the carriage wheels of the wife of the man whose rubbish is sold by the 1,000,000 copies and given away with the popular brand of soap. I will starve if it must be, but I will live my own life. Something of one of these decisions it will be well to adopt at the start. When the decision is made, it is to be abided by. A man has no more right to complain at the loss of the thing he deliberately let go than he has to be angry that 2 and 2 make 4. It is true that few are able to make the higher choice without some secret thought, that unacknowledged hope which, all intangible as it is one of the most comforting delusions of life. That hope not put into word even in the most secret chamber of the heart, yet without which so many heroisms would be impossible. Some deeply hidden conviction that fortune will to them be so propitious that all discouraging precedents will be violated. It is so hard for youth to believe that anything it desires is impossible. The ardent young author, working steadfastly in his attic, has a firm faith that fame and fortune will one day be his in abundance. That this dream is so often false is profoundly pathetic. But it is not a vital misfortune, if the man be virile enough not to be soured by disappointment and disillusion. Character is the great stake for which one plays the game of life, and if this is won, the rest is of less, no matter how grave, weight. The failure of literary aspirations is bitter, but the worst is escaped as long as one is able firmly to say, I chose the pleasure of an unviolated literary conscience, the delight of serving art with my best endeavor, rather than the rewards of meretricious work. I have had what I bargained for, and I stand by that ungrudgingly. If I hoped for a bonus at the hand of fortune, and have not got it, at least I have received the price which I stipulated. The price stipulated in such a bargain with life is at least sure. He who elects to serve literature and to do his best for the pleasure of such doing cannot be robbed of his reward, while he who works for other advantages may, and often does, fail of securing them. He who makes the pleasure of being true to his best instincts his purpose is secure of the satisfaction which comes of nobility of intention and consciousness of high aim, while the man who seeks money and notoriety often comes to grief. A writer may even be willing to stoop at any and every low device to gain popularity, and yet may miss it. It is one thing for a man to be willing to sell himself to the devil, and quite another to induce the devil to pay his price. No man devotes his life to any work without some more or less clearly defined idea of what he shall gain from such a course. The reward of literature is not money, although occasionally that will come in abundance, and in these days usually rewards in moderation any literary labor done at all well. The reward is not reputation, albeit that cannot but be pleasant to any man who wins it, for no sane human being can remain totally indifferent to the approval and applause of his fellows. These things are good, but they are not the true guerdons of art. The real reward of literature is the joy of producing it. There are few earthly delights which can compare with the pleasure of artistic creation. To feel a work grow in the mind and take shape under the hand. To look on a new-found idea as a watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. To be lifted above whatever is small or petty or annoying, whatever is unsatisfactory in human life, by the power of the creative impulse. That is the true good of the literary worker, and it is a good so great that all others may well seem petty beside it. There is much else which is attractive and desirable: contact with alert minds, familiarity with the thought of the world, and the enjoyment of an artistic atmosphere. But these are less certain, and are really of less importance. The most admirable return for all one's labors that he hath under the sun is the joy of a congenial pursuit and the inspiration of creative effort. This may seem somewhat far from the standards of a workaday world. It is certain that no transports of literary creation will pay the coal bill or settle an account at the grocer's. Necessity knows no law, and a man may be forced to drudgery with the pen as with the pickaxe. To him, however, who is willing and able to sacrifice material to intellectual ends, what I have said is of actual and practical application. End of chapter 26. Recording by Mackenzie Nicole Greenwood.